They didn't come to talk, and they didn't come to leave. The dust rose first. Not fast, not loud. Just a slow curtain lifting off the dry earth, drifting across the horizon like something alive. Ethan Cole stood in the doorway of his cabin, one hand resting on the rough wood frame, the other hanging loose by his side. The morning sun had barely cleared the hills, casting long shadows that stretched across the empty stretch of land he called home. 12 miles from the nearest town. 40 acres of dry grass, one tired horse, and a roof that leaked when the rain remembered him. He squinted into the light, watching the shape form beneath the dust. Riders. More than a few. Too many. They moved as one body, steady, deliberate. No shouting. No rush. Just silence. The kind that settles heavy before something changes. Ethan stepped forward, boots pressing into the dirt. The boards creaked behind him as the door shifted in the wind, but he didn't turn back. Couldn't. Not now. The riders came closer, and the number began to settle in his mind like a weight. Not 10. Not 20. Dozens. Then more. Lines behind lines. Horses dark against the rising sun, feathers and leather catching light in quiet flashes. 500, maybe more. And not one of them broke formation. Not one raised a weapon. That was the part that didn't make sense. Ethan had seen men ride with anger before. He'd seen dust kicked up by fear, by greed, by men chasing something they thought they deserved. This wasn't that. This was something else. Something older. Something patient. The lead riders slowed first. Then the rest followed like a tide, pulling back just short of the shore. They stopped about 30 yards from his cabin. Close enough that he could see their faces. Close enough that they could see his. Still, no one spoke. The wind moved through the dry grass with a soft whisper. A loose board on the barn tapped once, then again. Ethan swallowed, slow. His throat felt like sand. He glanced once toward the hills behind them. No dust trails from the town. No sheriff. No help coming. Just him. And them. His eyes moved back to the front line. That's when he saw it. A single rider stepping forward. Older. Broad shoulders. Hair braided with beads that caught the sun. In quiet glints. No pain on his face. No sign of haste. Just presence. The kind that didn't need to prove anything. The man raised one hand. Not high. Just enough. And behind him, something shifted. Not movement, but attention. Every rider, every horse, every breath seemed to lean into that single gesture. Ethan felt it in his chest before he understood it. Like standing too close to a storm you couldn't hear yet. The man spoke, but the wind carried the words away before they reached him. Low. Measured. Not a threat. Not an invitation. Just a question. Ethan didn't answer. He couldn't. Not yet. Because in that moment, something else caught his eye. Hanging from the saddle of one of the riders, just behind the leader. A small piece of leather. Dark. Worn. Familiar. His breath slowed. Then stopped. The world around him seemed to pull back, sound fading into a dull hum as memory pressed forward without asking permission. Rain. Cold. Hard rain. The kind that stung your skin and turned the ground into slick mud beneath your boots. The river louder than it should have been, swollen and angry, pushing against its banks like it had something to prove. And a voice. Not loud. Not clear. But desperate. Ethan blinked once, standing there in the morning light, and realized his hands had tightened without him noticing. He knew that leather. He knew exactly where he'd seen it. And suddenly, none of this felt like a coincidence anymore. The leather piece swayed gently against the saddle, tapping once against the worn wood as the horse shifted its weight. And that small, quiet sound was enough to pull Ethan Cole back into the night before, back into the rain that had no patience and the river that refused to listen, because 12 hours earlier there had been no riders, no silence, no watching eyes. Only the storm rolling low across the valley and the kind of darkness that made a man feel smaller than he was. Ethan had been out, near the fence line, fixing a loose post by lantern light, the wind cutting sideways and carrying the smell of wet earth and distant thunder, when he heard it. Not the river, not the wind, something else, a voice that did not belong to the land, thin and breaking, like it had already traveled too far. He stood still. Then, listening, because out here you learned the difference between a coyote's cry and something human. And this was human. There was no doubt in it. He left the lantern hanging on the post and followed the sound, boots slipping in the mud, coat already soaked through before he reached the edge of the riverbank. The water was higher than it should have been for that time of year, pushing fast, carrying branches and debris in a restless current. And at first he saw nothing, just the dark surface shifting under the rain. Then the voice came again, closer now, and he spotted movement near the bend where the current curved hard against the rocks, a figure half in the water, struggling not against the river, but against something deeper than the current, something like exhaustion. Ethan did not think about it. He never did in moments like that. He stepped in, the cold hitting him sharp and immediate, the kind that takes your breath before you can prepare for it. And he moved toward her, steady, careful, because rushing would have taken both of them. She saw him then, her eyes wide, not with relief, but with something else, something that made her pull back even as the water pulled her forward. He reached her anyway, one hand catching her arm, the other bracing against the current, and for a second they stayed like that, balanced between slipping and standing, her breath quick, his steady, the rain running down both their faces like it did not care who they were. He spoke. Then, low, simple, the way you speak to a frightened horse, not pushing, not demanding, just enough to let her know he was there. She did not answer, but she stopped pulling away, and that was enough. He guided her toward the bank, step by careful step, until the ground rose under their feet, and the river let go. She collapsed first, hands in the mud, shoulders shaking, and Ethan stepped back, giving her space, because something in the way she held herself told him that distance mattered more than comfort. He removed his coat and placed it near her without touching her again. The leather pouch at her neck slipped free as she moved, falling against the ground between them, and he noticed it only because she reacted, quick, protective, pulling it close like it carried more than just weight. He did not ask, he did not reach for it. He just turned slightly, giving her the dignity of not being watched too closely. The storm moved on slowly, leaving behind the kind of quiet that follows something unresolved, and after a long moment she spoke, her English careful, shaped by a different rhythm, telling him only what he needed to know and nothing more. That men had followed her, that she could not stay, that he should forget he ever saw her. Ethan looked at the dark tree line beyond the river, then back at the way her hands trembled as she tried to stand, and he made a choice that did not feel like a decision. He pointed toward his cabin, just a quarter-mile uphill, a place with a fire and dry ground, and said she could rest there until the rain stopped. Nothing more, nothing less. She hesitated, not because she did not understand, but because she understood too well what it meant to trust a man she did not know, especially one who looked like him. But the storm had taken most of her strength, and the cold had taken the rest, so she nodded once, slow, and followed him, keeping a careful distance as they walked, the mud pulling at their boots, the wind easing just enough to let the night breathe again. And when they reached the cabin, Ethan opened the door and stepped aside, letting her enter first, because some things you do not explain, you just do. And that was the last moment before everything began to carry a different weight. The cabin held the warmth the storm could not follow, but it did not feel safe. Not yet, not for her, and not entirely for him. The fire cracked low in the corner, throwing soft light against the wooden walls while the last drops of rain slid from the roof outside in slow, uneven rhythm. Ethan kept his distance after closing the door, moving first to the hearth to stir the coals back to life, giving her time to take in the space, because he could feel it in the way she stood just inside the doorway, not stepping further, not relaxing, her eyes scanning everything. The table, the chair, the narrow bed against the far wall, measuring, weighing, deciding if any of it could turn against her. He did not speak for a while, just added a piece of dry wood, and let the fire answer for him, steady and simple, something that did not ask anything in return. She finally moved then, slow, cautious, lowering herself onto the edge of the chair like she was prepared to stand again at any second, her hands still holding that leather pouch close against her chest, not loosely, not carelessly, but with a quiet intensity that made it clear the object mattered more than comfort. Ethan noticed it again, the stitching worn but careful, the shape small enough to carry but heavy enough to mean something. And still he said nothing about it. Instead, he poured water into a tin cup and placed it on the table between them, not handing it to her, just leaving it there. A choice. She watched it for a moment before reaching, her fingers trembling slightly as she lifted it, and even that small act seemed to take effort, the kind that comes after running too far and trusting too little. When she drank, she did not look at him. Not yet. Her gaze stayed low, fixed somewhere between the cup and the floor, and when she spoke again, her voice had lost some of its edge, but not its caution. She told him her name, Nayeli, and the way she said it carried more weight than the word itself, like it was not something she offered easily. Ethan nodded once, simple, accepting, and gave his own name in return, nothing more. Because names out here were enough, anything beyond that came later. Or not at all. The silence settled again. Not uncomfortable, just unfinished, and outside the wind had died completely, leaving the land in that strange stillness that comes after a storm, the kind that makes every small sound feel louder than it should. Ethan moved to a small shelf and pulled down a strip of clean cloth and a tin of salve. Placing them beside the water without comment, her eyes flicked to them, then to him. And for the first time there was something different there, not trust. Not yet. But something that was not fear either, something closer to uncertainty, like she did not know what to make of him. She hesitated before reaching for the cloth, carefully tending to a scrape along her arm. Her movements precise, practiced, not unfamiliar with taking care of herself, and that told him more than words would have, that she had not been running for the first time, that whatever followed her was not new, just closer now. When she finished, she set the cloth aside and adjusted the pouch again, almost without thinking, and that small motion drew Ethan's attention one more time, because it was not just protection, it was habit, the kind you build when something has been in your care for a long time. He leaned slightly against the wall, arms relaxed, and finally asked, not pressing, just offering space for truth if she chose to give it, who was following her. The question hung between them, light but heavy at the same time. Nayeli did not answer right away, her eyes lifting to meet his for the first time fully, and in them he saw something that had nothing to do with the storm or the river, something older, something that had learned to expect the worst before the best ever arrived. She looked at the door, then back at him, and when she spoke, her voice was steady, but quieter than before. Not men of her people, she said, men who looked like him. The words settled in the room like a shift in air, not accusing, not blaming, just stating something that could not be ignored. Ethan did not react the way most would, did not defend, did not explain. He just nodded once, because out here, truth did not need decoration, and after that, neither of them spoke for a while. The fire filled the space between them, the night stretching on slow and deliberate, until exhaustion began to claim its place. Nayeli's shoulders easing just enough to show it, her grip on the pouch loosening for the first time, not fully, but enough to suggest she might rest, and Ethan turned slightly away, giving her that space without making it obvious, because sometimes the only kindness a person can offer is not being watched. And in that quiet, with the storm gone and the land holding its breath, neither of them knew that the morning would not ask permission before it changed everything. The night passed without promise, but not without change, because sometime between the last crackle of the fire and the slow fading of the coals into ash, the distance between two strangers had shifted just enough to hold silence without fear. Ethan woke before the sun, the habit of years pulling him from sleep before the land fully stirred. The air inside the cabin was cooler now, the fire reduced to a dull glow, and for a moment he did not move, just listened, the kind of listening that comes from living too long with only your own breath for company. He heard the boards settle, the wind brushing faintly against the walls, and then something else, softer, steady, not a threat, just presence. Nayeli was still there, seated now against the far wall, not asleep, but not fully awake either, her eyes half open, her hand resting over the leather pouch like it had never left that place even in rest. Ethan pushed himself up slowly, careful not to startle her, and moved to the door, opening it just enough to let the early light slip in. The sky outside carried that pale blue that comes just before sunrise, the kind that makes everything feel suspended, unfinished. He stepped out onto the small porch, boots meeting dry wood, and took in the land. The storm had cleared everything. The air sharper now, cleaner, the ground still damp but settling. And for a few seconds it felt like any other morning, quiet, predictable, the kind he had built his life around. But then he saw it, not at first as a clear shape, just a disturbance along the far edge of the horizon, a thin line where the earth met the sky, something moving, not fast, not scattered, But together, the kind of movement that did not belong to cattle or wind. Ethan narrowed his eyes, stepping forward, the light growing just enough to define it. Riders, distant but undeniable, and more than a few. His chest tightened, not from fear, but from recognition, because nothing that moved like that ever came without reason. He stood there longer than he should have, watching as the line thickened, grew, separated into forms, the rising sun catching on shapes that reflected more than just movement. And behind him, the door shifted. Nayeli had stepped into the frame, her presence quiet but immediate. She did not ask what he saw. She did not need to. Her gaze followed his, and the moment she understood, something in her posture changed. Not panic, not retreat. Something else, something like acceptance. Like this was not unexpected, just unavoidable. Ethan glanced at her, then back to the horizon, and spoke only one word. Riders. She nodded once, slow, her hand tightening slightly over the pouch. And for the first time since he had met her, she did not look away from what was coming. The two of them stood there as the distance closed, the shapes becoming clearer, horses moving in lines too even to be random, too steady to be uncertain. And still no sound reached them, no shouting, no signal, just silence carried over miles of open land. Ethan felt the weight of it settle deeper, because silence like that was never empty. It was chosen, deliberate, the kind that meant something had already been decided long before arrival. He stepped off the porch then, boots pressing into the damp earth, moving a few yards forward as if closing the distance would somehow make it clearer, but it did not. It only made the number harder to ignore, dozens becoming hundreds, the line stretching wider than his land could hold. And beside him, Nayeli remained still, her eyes fixed, not fearful, not pleading, just watching. And then she spoke, her voice quiet but certain. They are not here for you. Ethan turned slightly, the words settling in slower than they should have. Not here for me. He repeated, more to himself than to her. She shook her head once, her gaze never leaving the riders. They are here because of me. The air shifted then, not with wind, but with understanding, the kind that comes too late to change anything. Ethan looked back at the horizon, at the riders who now filled it, and realized that whatever choice he had made the night before, it had already traveled further than he had thought, and it was no longer his alone to carry. The riders did not hurry, and that was the first thing that made Ethan understand this was not a chase, not a pursuit, but an arrival. The kind that carries its own time and does not bend for anyone standing in its path. The sun climbed higher behind them, turning the dust into a pale gold haze that softened their shapes, but did nothing to hide their number. 500 or near enough, stretching wide across the land like a line drawn by something older than fences or ownership. Ethan remained where he stood, a few steps off the porch, his shoulders squared not out of defiance, but because there was nowhere else to stand. Beside him Nayeli did not move either, her presence quiet but grounded, as if she had already stepped into whatever this moment was meant to become. The distance closed slowly, each hoofstep too far to hear, but close enough now to feel, like a rhythm carried through the ground rather than the air. Ethan noticed details as they came into view, the leather worn but cared for, the feathers tied with purpose, the way no rider spoke or broke formation. Even the horses seemed to understand that this was not a place for noise. This was something else, something measured. When they reached about 40 yards from the cabin, the front line slowed, then stopped, and the rest followed in a ripple that moved through the entire group without a single command spoken aloud. Silence settled again. Heavier now, because it was shared. Ethan's eyes moved across the faces, not searching for threat, but for meaning. And what he found unsettled him more than anything else could have. There was no anger there, no urgency, just focus. Like each man already knew why he had come and did not need to question it. The rider at the front stepped forward alone, the same man Ethan had seen earlier, older, steady, carrying himself with a kind of quiet authority that did not need display. He brought his horse to a stop about 20 feet from Ethan and looked at him directly, not past him, not through him, but at him, as if weighing something that could not be spoken yet. Ethan held that gaze, not as a challenge, but because looking away felt like a kind of answer he was not ready to give. The man's eyes shifted then, just slightly, moving from Ethan to Nayeli, and something changed. not in posture, not in expression, but in the space between them, recognition, deep and immediate, like a thread, pulled tight across distance and time. Naeli stepped forward then, just one step, and that was enough. The entire line of riders behind the man adjusted without moving, their attention sharpening in a way that could be felt more than seen. Ethan glanced at her, noticing for the first time that her hand had left the pouch, not dropped, not forgotten, but lowered, as if it no longer needed to be held so tightly. The man spoke then, his voice carrying across the short distance with a calm weight, each word deliberate. He spoke in a language Ethan did not understand, but the meaning did not feel hidden. It felt present in the tone, in the way Naeli responded, her voice softer, but steady, answering without hesitation. The exchange lasted only a few seconds, but it held something larger than its length, something that stretched beyond the two of them into the line of riders behind. When it ended, the man nodded once, slow, and then did something Ethan did not expect. He dismounted, not quickly, not ceremonially, just a simple motion, boots touching the ground as if this land, even here, even now, was not unfamiliar to him. He took a few steps forward, stopping just short of where Ethan stood, and then he looked at him again, closer now, clearer, and spoke in careful English, his voice shaped by a different rhythm but steady in its meaning. "You brought her out of the river." Ethan did not answer immediately, not because he was unsure, but because the way the words were spoken made it feel like more than a question. He nodded once. Simple. The man held his gaze a moment longer, then continued, "You gave her shelter." Ethan nodded again. The wind moved lightly across the space between them, carrying nothing but dust and quiet. The man's eyes did not harden, did not soften. They simply remained, steady, measuring. And then he said something that settled deeper than anything else had that morning. "You did not take from her." Ethan felt the weight of that, not as an accusation, but as something being confirmed. He shook his head once. "No." The man studied him for a breath longer, then turned slightly, glancing back toward the riders, and what happened next did not come with warning. It did not build, it did not announce itself, it simply happened. The first rider behind him lowered his head, just slightly, then another, and another, until the motion spread through the entire line. 500 riders, all lowering their heads in the same quiet gesture. Not submission, not surrender, something else, something Ethan could not name, but could feel, settle into the ground beneath his feet. And in that moment, standing between the cabin he had built and the people he did not know, he realized this was never about what he had done. It was about what he had not done, and somehow, that had traveled farther than anything else ever could. The gesture held longer than Ethan expected. 500 men and just as many horses standing in a stillness that did not ask for attention, yet commanded all of it. And when the last head returned upright, nothing felt the same as it had a moment before. Not the land, not the air, not even the distance between the man in front of him and the cabin behind him. The older man studied Ethan one more time, not searching now, but deciding, as if something unseen had settled into place. Then he turned slightly toward Naeli and spoke again in his own language, softer this time, the kind of tone that carried familiarity rather than command. Naeli listened, her posture shifting in a way Ethan had not seen before, not smaller, not guarded, but grounded, like she had stepped back into something that had always been hers. She answered, and this time her voice carried further, not louder, but steadier. The exchange moved between them like something practiced, something rooted deeper than the moment, and Ethan realized he was no longer at the center of what was happening. He had only opened the door to it. The older man then reached into the fold of his coat and drew out a small object, wrapped in cloth, worn at the edges. He held it for a second before offering it forward, not to Ethan, but to Naeli. She stepped closer and accepted it with both hands, careful, deliberate, when she unwrapped it. The leather pouch at her chest seemed to answer, her fingers brushing against both, as if confirming something unseen. Her eyes lowered briefly, then lifted again, and there was no fear left in them now, only clarity, the kind that comes when a path is no longer uncertain. She turned toward Ethan then, and for the first time since the river, she stepped closer to him without hesitation, the movement small, but it carried weight. She reached up and removed the pouch from around her neck. holding it for a moment between her hands, and then she extended it toward him. Ethan did not move right away, not because he did not understand the gesture, but because he understood it too well. Objects like that did not change hands without reason. They were not gifts in the way town people spoke of gifts. They were something else, something tied to trust, to history, to responsibility. Naeli held it there, steady, not pushing, not pulling back, just offering. And after a moment, Ethan reached out and took it, the leather warm from where it had rested against her, lighter than it looked, but heavier than it felt. He did not open it, did not question it. He just held it. And that seemed to be enough. The older man watched this exchange without interruption, and when it was done, he nodded once more, slower this time, as if marking the end of something rather than the beginning. He spoke again in English, his words clear despite the quiet. You gave without taking. Now you are seen. The sentence did not sound like praise. And it did not sound like a warning. It sounded like something being placed, like a stone set into the ground where it would remain. Ethan looked at the pouch in his hand, then back at Naeli, who now stood not beside him, but between him and the riders, her place no longer uncertain. The wind moved lightly across the open land again, carrying with it the faint sound of leather shifting, horses breathing, small things that returned the world to motion without breaking the stillness. Ethan felt something shift inside him then, not fear, not pride, something quieter, something closer to understanding, because he saw it now. The reason no weapons had been raised, the reason no voices had been lifted, this had never been a confrontation. It had been a measure, a question asked without words and answered without defense. The older man stepped back then, placing a small distance between himself and Ethan once more, and as he did, the line of riders behind him adjusted, not forward, not back, just enough to signal that whatever had needed to happen here had already happened. Naeli looked at Ethan one last time. Not long, not heavy, just enough. And in that brief glance, there was something like gratitude, but deeper, something that did not need to be named. She turned then and walked toward the older man, her steps steady, her shoulders no longer carrying the weight they had the night before, and Ethan remained where he stood, the pouch still in his hand, watching as she returned to the place she belonged, while the land around him settled into a quiet that felt different now, not empty, but full of something that would not leave when the riders did. The riders did not leave right away, and that was the second thing Ethan noticed, not movement, not sound, but the choice to remain, as if departure required its own moment just as much as arrival had. Naeli had reached the older man now, standing beside him with a quiet certainty that had not been there the night before, and yet she did not mount a horse, did not turn her back fully on the cabin. Instead she remained where she was, one step within her people and one step still connected to where she had been. Ethan stood with the pouch in his hand, feeling its presence without opening it, the leather worn smooth by time, edges softened by years of being carried. He turned it slightly, noticing the stitching, careful, deliberate, not the kind of work done quickly or without meaning. And something about that detail stayed with him, because things made like that were not meant to be lost or given lightly. The older man followed his gaze and spoke again, his voice lower now, meant only for the space between them. It does not belong to you. Ethan looked up, meeting his eyes, and nodded once. I know. The man continued without pause. But it was placed in your hand, and that matters. The words settled slowly, not as instruction, but as something closer to truth. Ethan glanced at Naeli, who watched him with that same steady look. No urgency, no demand, just presence. And he understood then that whatever was inside the pouch was not something he needed to see to understand. It was something he needed to hold, at least for now. The wind shifted again, carrying with it a faint sound from the far edge of the land, not from the riders, but from beyond them, distant, uneven, the kind of movement that did not belong to this gathering. Ethan's eyes moved past the line of horses, narrowing slightly as he tried to make sense of it. And the older man noticed, his posture changing just enough to acknowledge it. Naeli turned as well, her gaze following the same direction, and for the first time since the riders had arrived, there was a break in the stillness, not from them, but from something approaching that did not understand the silence it was entering. 3 figures appeared on the far ridge, small at first, then clearer as they came down the slope. Their movement faster, less controlled, not aligned with the quiet rhythm that held everything else in place. Ethan felt the shift immediately, not fear, but recognition. These were not part of what had arrived. These were something left over from before, something unfinished. The riders did not react the way most men would. No hands moved to weapons, no voices called out. Instead, the line remained exactly as it was, unchanged. As if what approached did not alter what had already been decided, the older man stepped slightly to the side, not blocking Ethan, not protecting him, just creating space. A choice, not a command. And in that space, Ethan stood alone again, the pouch in his hand, the cabin behind him, and whatever was coming now in front of him. The three figures drew closer, their horses slowing as they reached the edge of the gathered riders, confusion evident even at a distance, because what they expected to find was not what stood before them. One of them called out something. The words carried faintly, but without meaning in the still air. No one answered. The silence held, steady and unbroken, and that seemed to unsettle them more than any threat could have. Ethan did not move, did not step forward, did not step back. He simply stood, because something in the way the riders remained told him that this moment was not theirs to control. It was his, not by force, not by right, but by the simple fact that he had been the one to act when no one else had. The three riders came to a stop, their eyes moving across the line, then settling on Ethan, and for a second, the world seemed to narrow to that single point. Not a standoff, not a challenge, just a question waiting to be answered without words. Ethan felt the weight of the pouch again, the quiet presence of it in his hand, and he understood then that what had begun at the river had not ended when he brought her to the cabin. It had only changed shape, and now, standing in the open with 500 witnesses and 3 men who did not belong to the silence, he realized that sometimes the hardest thing a man could do was nothing at all, and still mean it. The 3 men slowed before they reached the line, not because they chose to, but because something in the air forced them to, the kind of stillness that does not push back yet does not yield either. Their horses shifted uneasily beneath them, sensing what their riders could not name. One of the men spoke again, louder this time, his voice cutting across the quiet, but finding nothing to hold on to. The words fell flat, as if the land itself refused to carry them further. Ethan did not respond. He did not even turn fully toward them. He simply stood where he was, the pouch resting in his hand, his posture unchanged, and that lack of reaction seemed to unsettle them more than any answer would have. The man at the front looked past Ethan then, his eyes scanning the line of riders, taking in the number, the stillness, the fact that not a single one of them moved to meet his presence. Confusion crept into his expression, not fear, not yet, but something close to it, something that comes when a man realizes the rules he understands no longer apply. Behind Ethan, the cabin door shifted slightly in the breeze, a soft creak that sounded louder than it should have, and for a moment, everything seemed to pause around that small sound. The older man stepped forward then, not toward the 3 riders, but slightly ahead of Ethan, placing himself just enough in view to be acknowledged without making himself the center. He did not raise his voice, did not change his pace, he simply existed in the space between, and that was enough. The 3 men saw him now, truly saw him, and something in their posture changed, their shoulders tightening, their hands no longer resting easily, not reaching for anything, but no longer at ease either. The older man spoke, his English measured, each word placed carefully. You followed what was not yours. The sentence did not accuse, did not demand. It simply stated. And in that simplicity was something heavier than anger. One of the men laughed, short, uncertain, the kind of sound meant to fill space rather than hold meaning. He gestured vaguely, saying something about land, about finding what was lost, about things that did not belong to anyone until they were claimed. But the words did not carry weight here. They sounded smaller than they intended, as if the land itself did not recognize them. Naeli stepped forward then, not quickly, not forcefully, just one step. And that was enough to shift everything again. The 3 men looked at her, and for a brief second, their expressions changed, recognition flickering across their faces, but it did not last, because what stood before them now was not the same girl they had followed through the storm. She did not hold herself the same way, did not stand alone the same way. She stood within something larger now, something that did not need to speak to be understood. She said nothing, not a single word, but her presence carried more than any explanation could have. The man in front of the three shifted in his saddle, his gaze moving between her and Ethan, trying to place the pieces together, trying to understand how something that had seemed so simple the night before had become something else entirely. Ethan remained still, feeling the weight of the pouch again, not as an object, but as a point of balance, something that had turned a moment into a line that could not be crossed the same way twice. The older man spoke again, softer now, but clearer. You came to take, but nothing here can be taken. The words settled into the space between them, and for the first time, the three men had no answer, not because they did not have words, but because none of them seemed to fit anymore. The silence returned, deeper than before, and it held them there, not trapped, not forced, just present, until slowly, almost without realizing it, one of the men lowered his gaze, just slightly. Then another shifted his reins, his horse stepping back half a pace. Then another, small movements, barely noticeable, but enough to change the direction of what was happening. Ethan watched it unfold without moving, understanding now that this was not about winning or losing, not about who stood stronger. It was about what remained when nothing was said, and one by one, without command, without signal, the three men turned their horses, not quickly, not in retreat, but in quiet recognition that whatever they had come for was no longer something they could reach. And as they rode away, the dust they left behind did not rise high, did not linger. It settled quickly, as if the land had already decided it would not remember them. The dust settled faster than it should have, as if the land itself had no interest in holding on to what had just passed through it. And for a long moment after the three riders disappeared beyond the low ridge, no one moved. Not Ethan, not Naeli, not the 500 men who had come and now remained. The silence returned, but it was no longer heavy, no longer waiting. It had changed into something quieter, something resolved, like a breath finally released after being held too long. Ethan looked out across the open stretch of land where the riders had vanished, then down at the pouch still resting in his hand. The leather no different than it had been a few minutes ago, but everything around it had shifted. He turned it once more, feeling the edges, the stitching, the weight of something he did not need to open to understand. Behind him, the cabin stood just as it always had, weathered wood, a door that did not quite sit straight, a place built for one man and his silence. And yet it did not feel the same anymore, because it had been seen, not by the town, not by men who counted worth in cattle or coin, but by something that did not measure that way at all. The older man stepped forward again, his movements unhurried, stopping at the same distance he had before, his eyes meeting Ethan's one last time. There was no question in them now, no weighing, just acknowledgement. He spoke quietly, his voice carrying only as far as it needed to. What is given in truth does not return empty. Ethan held his gaze, not fully understanding the words, but feeling their meaning settle anyway. The man inclined his head slightly, not a bow, not submission, something simpler, something human, and then he turned, walking back toward his horse. Naeli remained where she was for a moment longer, standing between the two worlds she had crossed in less than a day. Her eyes moved once more to Ethan, and this time there was no hesitation, no distance, only a quiet clarity. She stepped forward, closing the small space between them, and gently placed her hand over his for just a second, not holding, not asking, just acknowledging. Then she withdrew, turning back without another word, and walked toward her people. The older man had already mounted, and as she reached his side, he extended a hand to help her up, not as a necessity, but as a gesture, and she accepted, settling onto the horse with ease, as if she had never left that place. The riders began to move then, not all at once, not in a rush, but in a slow, deliberate motion that carried through the entire line like a quiet wave. Horses turning, bodies shifting, the formation dissolving not into chaos, but into direction. And within moments, the long line that had filled the horizon began to stretch and fade, moving away the same way it had come, steady, silent, leaving no mark beyond what had already been changed. Ethan stood there as they went, not stepping forward, not calling out, just watching, the pouch still in his hand, the wind picking up just enough to brush against his coat, carrying with it the faintest sound of leather and movement until even that was gone. And then there was only the land again, wide and quiet, as if nothing had happened at all. But Ethan knew better, because something had been left behind, not in the ground, not in the air, but in the way the silence felt now. He turned slowly, walking back toward the cabin, each step measured, not heavy, not light, just certain. He paused at the door, looking once more at the open land before stepping inside. The fire had gone out completely now, the room cool and still, unchanged in every way that could be seen, and yet not the same. He set the pouch down on the table, not opening it, not moving it further, just placing it there, and for a long moment, he stood looking at it. Then he stepped back, turning toward the small window, the light of the morning stretching across the floor, quiet, steady, and outside, nothing moved. No riders, no dust, no voices, just the wind, and the kind of silence that no longer felt empty, but earned.